Good evening. Welcome to Arena Stage and apparently our standing room only civil dialogue. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Seema Sueko. I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here at Arena, and it's a great honor to welcome you. How many people here have been to Arena Stage before? Raise your hand if you have. Excellent. How many of you have been to one of our civil dialogues? Oh, just a handful of you. Terrific. So let me give you a little bit of contextualization about the civil dialogue. This idea came to us from Professor Amitai Etzioni, to my right here, who approached us a few months ago, recognizing what I imagine many of you are recognizing, which is that in our nation, we've somehow deteriorated our ability to have civil dialogue and become more polarized. And we were craving the ability to speak with people with whom we might have different points of view. And so he proposed this idea of the civil dialogues. It sounded like a wonderful idea because, you know, in the theater, night after night, that's exactly what we try to do with the art. Present a play that might have multiple perspectives in the hopes that the audience then speaks with one another, speaks in their car ride home, or we do post-show conversations about the difficult topics in those plays. What we didn't know was whether we could do civil dialogues outside of the context of a play. So we tested a few of these out. This is now the fifth one, and we were thrilled to see that people were interested. Some of the past topics dealt with privacy and surveillance, race relations, but no doubt, as you can tell by how packed this room is, perhaps today's civil dialogue on deplorables and who is a deplorable is drawing a lot of interest. So I thank you so much for being here with your open hearts and open minds. The point of the civil dialogue is to be able to speak, to share your point of view, but then also, and perhaps most importantly, to also listen. And so I invite you to test your speaking and listening skills with me, if you indulge me, in this little exercise. Turn to somebody you didn't come with, someone you don't know, and just share why you came. Only going to take 30 seconds for this. And then listen to why they came. So I'll give you about a minute for this total. Wonderful. Very exciting to hear all the conversation. Thank you all so very much. Hopefully you met somebody you didn't know before, and hopefully you'll continue the conversation beyond the civil dialogue here this evening. So without further ado, let me just say one more thing. Turn off your cell phone or any other noisemaker you may have that could be distracting, and I now turn it over to the great Amitai Etzioni, who will lead us through this discussion. Thank you, Amitai.
Seema, thank you very, very much indeed. It has been a wonderful opportunity to work together with Arena Stage. And thank you all for coming in despite this warning of tornadoes and hurricanes and rain flooding. Delighted to have you all with us. Indulge me just for a very short personal comment how I got into the interest in having dialogues. In 1946, I was in 10th grade in school, and I dropped out of school to go to fight the British. And that was part of an anti-colonial power wave which spread from India to Ghana. I happened to be in Palestine. And when the war was over and I wanted to go to college, the university said, "You didn't finish 10th grade. I mean, come on." And so I was fairly desperate, had no income, and I read in a newspaper that Martin Buber, one of the most renowned philosophers, was setting up an institute in which he would give ribbon board. And so I went and sat at his feet for a year, and all I heard that year was about dialogue. And for Buber, as Seema already implied, dialogue was not a question of a cocktail chit-chat, but it's a question of truly listening, and above all, opening yourself up to the possibility that you are the one who will need to change in the process. So when I saw the rising polarization last year, I mentioned to a friend of mine, Eileen Rosenthal, who is on the board, and she introduced me to Edgar Dobie, who is the big honcho here, and we had lunch at at that moment we said, the real dialogue we want to have is between people who support Trump and people who oppose Trump. But by the end of the lunch, we got cold feet. We decided, you know what, that's kind of a risky proposition. Let's first have some dry runs. So we did 4, we did 1 race relations. Once we survived that, we were ready for the mother of all dialogues, which we're going to have today. Now, I'll turn it over to Mom very shortly to the panel, but I want to explain that they all agreed that this is going to be a civil dialogue, and we're not going to demonize, we're not interested in tweets or personalities. We talk about ideas, we want to understand what the different camps feel about the issue of the day. And to enforce this agreement, I reminded them that we are in a theater, so there are trapdoors underneath the seats for those who will get uncivil. It's not going to happen, but what I did not tell them where they end up. And that's in a Chinese re-education camp. So I don't think we need to worry. Now, just 2 sentences about a subject. Political scientists have a concept which at least I find useful, and they talk about policy consensus. And what they mean by that is that it's possible for people who have different values, even conflicting values, still agree on a policy. And the example they keep coming back to is that in St. Louis, a group of mothers who are very strongly pro-life and a group of mothers who are very strongly pro-choice got together to improve child care centers. So that is kind of in a brief and simple way illustrates the idea. So what I suggested is that in order to get us away from analyzing personalities and such, to dig into substance, that some of us, I'm not saying every member of the group, will discuss, for instance, trade. So just to explain why I chose trade, when you ideologize and weaponize trade, we get in this kind of polarizing dialogue. On the one hand, you have people who say free trade is the ultimate good, it makes us all richer and happier, and anybody who doesn't see that is an ignoramus at best, or uneducated white, or whatever they're called.
Keep it civil.
On the other hand, when you look at it really under the hood, you see there really never was and never is free trade. There always is less and more managed trade. And no responsible economist talks about free trade. They talk about freer trade. And so once you see that the so-called free trade agreements are really pages and pages and pages on what you cannot do. You cannot bring Mexican trucks to the United States. The content of cars has to be built by people. We cannot bring medications. We cannot sell. In effect, all trade is managed to varying degrees. Once you get off the high horse of ideology, then you can see there is room for discussion how much we want to manage trade, how best to manage trade. But we get off this polarization. Second, and that's a more difficult example, immigration. Yes, there are some people, not actually many, who talk about open borders. And Europe tried it, by the way, and they're all paddling back. We all in the end recognize that Canada is very immigration-friendly, has 9 points in which to rank immigrants. So the question, how many people, what kind of people come to a country, should be lottery, should be family reunification. These are all questions one can discuss with easier to reach an understanding once we get off the ideological high horses. That may not be the case for when we come to basic values. So what I'm particularly looking forward to the discussion is what we do when we have what the so-called the culture war issues. When we say to each other that on the one hand, some of us believe very firmly and deeply in human rights. Some of us believe very firmly what our faith tells us, and these two things do not reconcile easy. So what I want to try to illustrate, and I'm done, is I think we can have a conversation on the issues. That's what we want to do tonight. Some of these are policy issues. Some are issues of profound principles. We're not introducing the speakers because you all have their bios and they generously agreed to avoid reading all their achievements, which are long. But we'll start with you, please.
Thank you, Amitai. Thank you for assembling this panel and for including me in it. Unlike some of the distinguished panel members, I am not a scholar here, so my perspective for you will be that of a layman, and I am in the deplorable category. My mother always used to tell me to consider the source. Whenever I brought home a fact or something, she would say, well, consider the source. And sometimes when you hear what somebody thinks, you wonder, how can they think that? So before I tell you what I think about any of the issues that we might talk about today, let me tell you a little bit about how I came to think this way, a sort of where I'm coming from intro. I'm Eileen O'Connor. After putting myself through college, I began my professional career as a CPA. While working as a CPA, I put myself through law school, after which I engaged in tax practice for several decades. In 2001, it was my honor to be nominated by President George W. Bush to head the tax division of the Department of Justice. I did that for 6 years, and after leaving that, I practiced law with a big law firm for 9 years. I left that a couple of years ago. I now have my own firm, and in my abundant spare time, I'm chairman of the Federalist Society's Executive Committee for the Administrative Regulation and Practice Group. I'm also vice chairman of the board of Americans United for Life and chairman of the board's legal committee. My understanding of the United States and its place in the world is the result of my upbringing. As I grew up, I learned about my country through the eyes of an immigrant. So I learned about the United States as it compared to other countries. You see, my mother was born and raised in Vienna, Austria. When she was 11, Hitler annexed Austria to be part of the Third Reich. With the young men sent off to war shortly thereafter, the young women were sent off to work on farms, be bomber spotters, and perform other non-combat duties. By the end of the war, my mother's family had lost all its possessions and many of its family members. When the war finally ended, Allied troops remained there to keep the peace. That's what happens at the end of a war. When you knock down one government, you've got to give it a new one for a while at least, until they can stand on their feet again. So my mother found work as a simultaneous translator for the Allied troops who were keeping the peace in Austria. There she met a young army officer who she later married and who later, again, became my dad. So I grew up having a sense of what life is like in a socialist country, what life is like in a war zone, and understanding the reality of war and the importance of America and Americans in the world. When Donald Trump first announced his candidacy for president, I didn't know a lot about him. I had not paid a great deal of attention to him over the years. I knew of him, of course. Anybody with a pulse in the United States had to be aware of Donald Trump. I knew he was a builder, a casino and beauty pageant owner, a golf course developer, a reality TV show star, but I don't gamble or watch beauty pageants or reality TV, so I hadn't really formed much of an opinion about him. As a matter of fact, early on in the campaign, I had this idea that perhaps he was running for president as kind of a lark. And then I came upon a book that he published in 2001 called Time to Get Tough. After reading that book, I realized he was very serious. Not only was he serious, but I also realized that I agreed with his identification of the problems that America was facing and his prescriptions for their cure. During the campaign, candidate Trump's speeches were completely consistent with the book that he had published a number of years before. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. Another thing you see in the book, which you also see not only in his campaign, but also today, every day in his public activities, is the deep and abiding appreciation and respect and love that he has for America's military and its first responders. In October 2016, I was pleased to join the Trump transition team, focusing on the Treasury Department. When President Trump won election, I became part of his Treasury transition landing team. One of the reasons it was such a pleasure for me to serve on President-elect Trump's transition team was his determination to keep his campaign promises. He had not made those promises lightly. He intended to keep them. And it was our charge as members of the transition team to identify and map out the steps that would be required for him to do so. I kept with me at all times a list of the promises that he had made during the campaign. I still keep that list, and I've marked off all the campaign promises that he's already kept, and those that he has tried to but has not been able to accomplish, either because of troubles with Congress or the courts. some people wonder how one can support President Trump, given some of his proclivities to do things like tweet things that you might find annoying. Well, here's how I think of that. You adopt a big, beautiful adult golden retriever and you bring him home and he's wonderful. He wags his tail. He plays with the kids. He brings in your morning newspaper. He runs after the tennis ball you throw and he brings it back to you. He bares his teeth and snarls and growls and barks and chases away mean, nasty, dangerous strangers. And then he goes into your closet and chews up your shoes. You know, you take the bad with the good. So a good illustration of this is news alerts that came on my iPhone on Thursday morning. Incomes in the United States were up substantially, suggesting the return of a strong middle class, a term I hate, but that's what they say. That's a good thing. Consumer prices had not risen as much as experts had predicted, a good thing. Jobless claims had dropped to a 49-year low. That was a good thing. And then a tweet about the death toll in Puerto Rico. There went another pair of shoes. So with that background, that's why I think what I think, and we'll talk about what I think as we get further into the discussion.
Thank you, Lee. I first want to thank Amitai for inviting me and for Arena for organizing this. I'm disagree with pretty much everything Donald Trump says or does, but I think it's really important to, nope, hold your applause. But I think it's really important for dialogues like this to take place. As an historian, I think the most important quality I can have is empathy, which of course, as you know, doesn't mean sympathy, but it means understanding why people think what they think. And so it's in that spirit that I want to say a few things. I should say, though, if you're comparing a president you like to a dog, that's probably not the best. Okay, fine.
I love dogs.
Yeah, I do. I have a dog. I love dogs. Anyway, as a historian, I want to, in my 5 minutes or so, introductory remarks, I just want to ask the question, where did Donald Trump come from? I don't mean, personally, but politically, historically. I think there's two important contexts to think about. One is the last 45 years in American society, where we've had wage stagnation, where Americans have been afraid of first being outcompeted by Japan, and then in many ways now China. We've had terrible recessions and wars that have gone very badly, not as badly as Vietnam, but still very badly. And so there's been a lot of fear and dissatisfaction with the, quote, establishment, I think, both by people who ideologically tend to favor more left-wing liberal ideas and those who tend to favor more conservative ones. And more specifically, the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, 2009, which I think made people both on the left and the right feel that someone had done something really wrong to have the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. And I think that's given rise to what is loosely called populisms, both on the right and the left. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren on the left, and Donald Trump, the best representative of the populism on the right. I can talk a lot about populism on the left because I identify myself with that point of view, but one of the problems with populism on the right, I think, is that from my point of view, it's fundamentally contradictory. On the one hand, populists on the right, like Donald Trump, like Steve Bannon, that my colleague on the left has become sort of friends with, or at least on the phone has, is that they, being on the right, being American conservatives, they have to talk about libertarian ideas, have to talk about cutting back the power of the state, have to talk about the need to deregulate the economy, to try to weaken labor unions. But if you're a populist, anything that term means, you have to want something that ordinary people want. And ordinary people in this country, even if they vote Republican, most of them want decent health care, a home they can afford, the environment protected, and all that means government has to do those things, because private enterprise is not going to do those things. And so Donald Trump's populism on the right rhetorically is very powerful. The talk about America, make America great again, is very powerful. But the substance of it, I think, is deeply contradictory. And I think that's part of the problem he's having right now, is that the only policy that the Republican Congress has really passed that's at all important is a tax cut, which is, whatever you think of populism, very anti-populist, because, of course, as most of you probably know, most of the benefits of that plan have gone to people who already had a lot of money. The second thing I want to say is and this disagrees some with what Lee said, I think. Americans want to look up to their presidents. Americans, we know our presidents aren't perfect. We've had presidents who have been much less than perfect in their personal lives. But Americans want to think that their children can look at what their presidents say and what they do and say, well, I might disagree with him and someday her, but I respect them. I'm sorry to say, I know Amitai didn't want us to talk about personality, but personality matters in politics. Personality matters in policy. And Donald Trump, to me, is not a serious man. He's a man who doesn't read books. He's a man who doesn't write his own books. He's a man who spends a lot of his time watching television, especially channels that he agrees with. He's a very skillful performer, charismatic, knows how to speak to his crowds. But that's not, to me, a serious president. A serious president is someone who, whatever their point of view, who cares about policy. Some conservatives compare Trump to Ronald Reagan. I disagree with Ronald Reagan almost as much as I disagree with Donald Trump. But Ronald Reagan was a serious man. He wrote his own speeches in many cases before he became president. He was very good at debating policy with liberals and with leftists. He had been a liberal and a leftist, in fact, so he knew empathetically where they were coming from in many ways. And he was an inspiring figure, I think, to people on the right. I don't think when Donald Trump finishes his administration, whether it's 4 years, as I hope, or 8 years, as other people on the panel hope, that people will look back at him as someone Americans could be proud of. And to me, that's a problem.
Do 60 million many working class people support the president because they have not been served, because liberals ignored them,
Yes.
or because they've been duped by some kind of fancy razzle-dazzle on television?
I think he was, in many ways, for a lot of people, a very refreshing alternative to Hillary Clinton, who gave people very little reason to vote for her. In fact, her campaign was mostly, I'm not Donald Trump. But it's important to say that we focus on Trump all the time. He's the center of all the news every day. But even more than many past presidents have been. And he wants to make himself that. But important to remember, he won the same percentage of the popular vote that John McCain did in 2008, who lost by 7% and lost in basically electoral vote landslide. So, we don't want to spend our time here redebating the 2016 election. I certainly don't. But I've done enough of that, as many people in the audience probably have as well. But it's important to remember that really Hillary Clinton lost that election in many ways more than Donald Trump won it, given the percentage of the vote he got.
Amitai, thank you very much for inviting us. I'm delighted to be here with my colleagues on the other side, as it were. Thank you all for coming, and Happy New Year to you as well, if that applies. I was a speechwriter and a transition advisor for the Trump campaign, and have written a book about it called The Republican Workers' Party, now available on Amazon and cheap at half the price. The title, The Republican Workers' Party, is something I ripped off Trump himself. He said, this is what the party will be. That gave offense, or at least puzzled, a great many people who wondered, workers, don't the Democrats have property rights in that term? And we thought not. And we thought, indeed, specifically that this is the group that we want to go after, and did so quite successfully, right? So there was something out there. There was a group out there that thought they had been left behind. by both the Democrats and by the old Republican Party. So to understand what happened in 2016, and by the way, somebody who's written in reviews of the book said this is the definitive account of a 2016 election, and who am I to disagree? Right? The election was a battle fought on two fronts. That's what you have to understand to make sense of it. On the one hand, yes, of course, against Hillary Clinton, not the Democrats, but against Hillary Clinton. And on the other hand, against the right-wing ideologues as represented by people like Ted Cruz. There are some people who want to think of Trump as the second coming of Ronald Reagan. Well, he's not. He's not even close, for a variety of reasons. He didn't, by the way, begin his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. There are a lot of differences. He's not an ideologue. I mean, he was a TV personality who liked hanging out with the construction people on his sites. But really what he was somebody who occupied the sweet spot in American politics, which is culturally somewhat conservative and economically middle of the road, even slightly left-wing. I know that. I mean, at one point I was talking to one of his children and said, most of my life I was Canadian. I said, Medicare in Canada is not nearly as bad as people say. And the next day Trump said, I hear good things about the Canadian medical system and Canadian Medicare, but we can do better. And that's exactly right. Right? So the message we wanted in the campaign to convey to people is that this will be the party of jobs. Trump said, I will be the greatest jobs president that America's ever seen. And if we could, health care as well. And we would leave the Democrats with bicycle lanes. Right? So give them all the precious liberalism that was so important to them, and we're going to concentrate on real issues. And the jobs are really coming back right now. So that's a great measure of success. This all came naturally to me, I expect, precisely because, it was only I only became American about 4 years back. So all of this is something I was well familiar with. And by the way, the tendency to describe what's happening solely in American terms, and Michael is a wonderful, wonderful historian, but populism for him is roughly what Jeeves is for P.G. Wodehouse, right? I mean, this is where you're going to go back to. But it's not about populism. It has greater affinities to conservative movements in other countries. And for me, I saw this as a phenomenon in which in England would be called the Primrose League. In Canada, it's called Red Toryism. It's a conservative philosophy. It's not even a philosophy. It's more like a sentiment, a feeling, a longing. I think it's no more intellectual than that. A longing for a prior time. That was a sense of make America great again, right? That we had lost something. So, we had lived through a time when America was coming off the rails, and make America great again. The message was we could do better than that. I was how am I doing on time? A couple of minutes? I was at a dinner a couple of years back with a Republican congressman who was going nuts over the Tea Party. He hated them. He called them right-wing Marxists. And I thought, hey, that's me. Right? Why? Because I'm a Marxist to the extent I see things in terms of a class struggle, right? Which is why we never wanted to beat up on Bernie. There were a lot of reasons not to beat up on Bernie Sanders, but the only Democrat in all of us we respected was Bernie. Okay? So I was a Marxist to the extent that I saw this through a class prism, but the difference between, say, a Trump and a Bernie Sanders is both wanted the socialist goal of a mobile and equal society, and Sanders thought the way to get to that socialist goal was through socialist means, and we thought the way to get there, to produce jobs, is through free market means, right? We were not libertarians. We were fighting the libertarians in all of this. And the only person we ended up really respecting was Bernie.
Thank you. I think we've found an island of common ground. And the common ground is that I would think everybody on this panel doesn't think much of Hillary Clinton. So maybe that's a start. Let's ask the question, why does Make America Great Again as a slogan resonate so much? I want to unpack that because I think for a progressive like me, it's really the key to understanding the appeal that Donald Trump has. And when you think about the fact that a billionaire who had a history of stiffing subcontractors who worked on his projects and a history of saying unkind things and doing unkind things about women should emerge as the champion of the forgotten American, it's quite remarkable. The forgotten American must have had a really hard time, must have felt really aggrieved to see Trump as a kind of avenging angel given Trump's own history. How could Hillary Clinton have lost the vote of white women by 10 points and lost the vote of men 3-1? So Make America Great Again. Why do so many Americans think that America was great sometime in the past? And I want to take you back to the post-war boom, the only period in American history, it lasted for 30 years, when the economy grew at an unprecedentedly rapid rate and it became more equal. Regular people got a fair shake. They felt they got a fair shake. Their living standards doubled in the course of a generation. You could afford to buy a house and a car on one income. And this is the period, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s. Well, what happened? Well, two things happened, really. One, ordinary working people started getting the short end of the stick. There was a version of globalization that took the position that ordinary working people were expendable, and that if Japanese cars or Japanese steel or later Chinese semiconductors, you name it, were cheaper, then it must be that we're not sufficiently competitive and these guys had better find something else to do. Wall Street, which had been very constructively leashed, housebroken by the New Deal, really came roaring back. And Democrats were as much a part of that as Republicans were. There was a bipartisan consensus around deregulating capitalism that had been regulated in the public interest so that ordinary people could get a fair shake. There was open season on unions. 4 of the last 5 secretaries came from of the Treasury came from Goldman Sachs. So the Democratic Party, I think most of us on the panel would agree, the presidential wing of the Democratic Party, by turning its back on ordinary working people, really created a sense of accumulated grievance that opened the door for an avenging angel as utterly improbable as Donald Trump. But there is a second dimension to this story. And the second dimension to this story during the same period is the attempted redemption of the promise of Abraham Lincoln to African Americans. So at the very same moment that white guys are taking it on the chin, America is doing a very heroic thing. It, through great struggle, through the alliance between the civil rights movement on the ground and the conversion of Lyndon Johnson in the White House, deciding that he's going to be a great civil rights president, through immense struggle and bloodshed. I knew Andy Goodman's family. People gave their lives. People gave their lives for the right to vote, which, by the way, the Republican Party is doing everything it possibly can to undermine, but that's another debate. So at the very moment that white guys in the Midwest and the South are taking it on the chin, we are saying, you know, it's 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. It's time. It's well past time for African Americans to be part of this country too. And by the way, it's time for women to have an equal shake as well. So if you are a white guy who used to be able to put bread on the table and hold your head up high from a factory job that wasn't a great deal of fun, but it made you feel like a man. And back in the day, the little woman was at home with a hot supper for you, and black folks were the servants. And that world has changed. Now, I think where we part company, those of us on the left with the right, is we say it was the change in the ground rules of the economic system that opened the door to Trumpism. Certainly we don't want to turn our back on African American civil rights or women's rights. Now, if you have a standard bearer like Hillary Clinton, who is taking $500,000 honoraria from Wall Street, thank you very much, and who is putting, and I don't mean to demean anybody here, but who is putting ground rules on bathrooms ahead of opportunities for workers, and then you get your clock cleaned by Donald Trump, it should not be a surprise. So I think the conflict that we ought to be having is Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren version of how we get our country back versus Donald Trump version of how we get our country back. And I think that's a fight that my friend Elizabeth Warren can win. And I hope she wins because she's a more credible emblem, both personally and in terms of the policy, of what it's going to take to get our country back to make America again. I'll close with one story. I got famous last year for 15 minutes because the phone rang one day and it was Steve Bannon. And Brother Bannon thought that he saw something in common between his view and my view, because I have been a critic of the kind of trade that sells out American workers. And Bannon talked about a kind of economic nationalism and its relationship to racial resentment. And I want to quote the line that probably cost Bannon his job. The Democrats, the longer they talk about identity politics, I got them. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity and we go with economic nationalism, we can crush the Democrats. The only problem is that Trump's version of economic nationalism is mostly fake, that the tariff policies are pot shots, that I was afraid that Bannon would actually influence Trump for the better, that we'd have a massive infrastructure program that would create lots of good blue-collar jobs, that we'd tax rich people, that we'd rebuild America, but that's not what Trump's about. And so I think, to close, the really important things for progressives like me is to understand the depths of the grievance that could produce a kind of cognitive dissonance where the savior for Americans who feel ripped off is a man like Donald Trump.
This is number 6. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Mike Hill, and I've never been famous, not even for 5 minutes. I represent the regular Joe up here on the stage, but that being said, I do have a little bit of a background that is slightly interesting. I'm the son of a Navy chief, and I put myself through college, University of Florida, working in a restaurant, and then I joined the United States Marine Corps, and I flew helicopters through the 90s during the Clinton presidency. Was on, as soon as I departed there, I went to Cornell Business School. So I do have a certain foot in the other side of the aisle, if you will, and have an Ivy League education for what that's worth. And a lot of debt, by the way. But, true.
What's Donald Trump going to do for your debt?
Right. So I think that the one thing that I wanted to communicate, and all of these people are professional speakers, et cetera, but I do have a couple of points that I wanted to make, and I see a number of younger people, and I don't know that I'm an expert. I know that I'm not an expert on this, but I do have a message to anyone that's a millennial or a Generation Xer like me and my wife, which is that I think that we have to look very clearly at what our ideals are and what America is. And this is not a shot at anyone on the stage, but I do believe that there has been a lack of gratitude towards the founding ideals and what the quote-unquote baby boomers have been able to experience. And through Mr. Kuttner's statement that basically these people all grew up and many of you during a period of extreme wealth and rising incomes, family homes, etc. And so for many of us, whether we're Gen X, Gen Y, people that are voting, we need to look more closely at what it means to have a country with the potential, the economic potential, to be great again. That doesn't mean more or less than that. I also wanted to say a couple things about domestic and foreign policy as it relates to the administration, because it's one thing to talk about the election. I think we've talked about that. I really don't want to talk about that. What I do want to say is that I do agree with Trump on a number of things that he's done in his administration, not just personality, et cetera. I believe that rolling back the Iran deal was a very smart move, and I believe that everybody in this room, with no exception, is better off that we're not in the deal. I believe that. So if that means making America great again, I'm all for it. I believe that pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord was a smart decision on his part, and I give you one point of fact. Every other country in the deal wants us to be in it, and the reason is there's no cost to them. There's only cost to you and me, and they were going to benefit. So it's things like that that are nothing to do with personality. They're nothing to do with the election. They're nothing to do with anybody else. They're just about giving the next generation a fair shake, and in order to do that, we need to make America great again through an economic robustness that we simply don't have over the past 25 years.
Just 1 second. Yeah. Can you just take a minute and explain why you think the climate agreements will cost only us and not the other countries? Can you?
Sure. I think that, I'm not a believe it or not, I'm not a climatologist, but my one point is this. If you read the news, which I don't recommend, but if you do happen to read the news, you will see that there was extreme pressure on every other signatory that we stay in. Well, who wouldn't want the United States to do that? Of course. You guys pay a lot. You have $20 trillion in debt, more than any other country on the planet. Pay more. And so for everybody that's my age, younger, 60 and under, we need to be thinking about this. We need to be thinking about maintaining our liberty, maintaining our freedom, maintaining our security, both economic and foreign policy, so that there is an America going forward.
Well, this is great, actually, because the one thing that I wanted to share was about climate. We didn't plan this. Hi, everyone. My name is Annalisa Dias. I'm like turning my back to people over here. Sorry. I am a playwright here in the DC community, and you can read about my bio. It's whatever. I'm not a professor, so I'm just going to talk the way that I talk. Thank you all. It's great to hear all of your perspectives. I wanted to talk a little bit about why I did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016 and why, I'm scared for the future of not only this country, but for the planet. One thing that informs much of my work in theater is a question that I always ask, that I've learned to ask from my native friends, which is, what kind of ancestors do we want to be to people 6 and 7 generations in the future? Not just my kids, but 6 and 7 generations down the line. And for me, the issue of climate justice, so not just talking about climate change and the way that the climate is changing, but as we move from an extractive economy to a generative economy, how can we make sure that the people on the front lines of the climate crisis are being centered? So that typically has been communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities who are already experiencing the brunt of the changing climate. So how can their voices be centered in moving toward a just transition to a generative future? And actually, I think that maybe that's there might be some common ground around what kind of future do we want for our children and our children's children. We may disagree on how to get there, but I think that question maybe is an area of common ground. And then, what else did I want to say? Oh, I wanted to thank Lee also for the way that you entered into the conversation was to acknowledge your positionality and to say where you came from and how you come to think the way that you think. So I'll share a little bit, I'll echo you if I can. I have the unlucky task of trying to wrap up this this panel, or at least give some kind of closing to the first round. So maybe I'll echo you and share a little bit about my perspective and how I came to think the way that I think. So my father is from Goa, which is a former Portuguese colony in India. So he grew up as a colonial citizen himself. Goa became part of India in 1961. And my mom she is from a working class family in Pittsburgh. So many of them are steel workers, or no longer steel workers, as it were. Many of those steel plants have closed. And so I come on both sides of my family from peoples who have had to work really hard for what they have gotten in the world. My dad is a doctor, and my mom is she's a nurse in the public school district where I grew up. And she, when she put herself through college by joining the military, so she was serving in Germany. She's technically a Vietnam-era vet, although she was never deployed to Vietnam. And so, I guess I say all this to share a little bit about my perspective on what it is like to grow up in a multiracial family, in a working class city, and to deal with, on a daily basis, the legacy of colonization and what that means, not just in this country, but in sort of a global context, because I have family all over the world. Which is a whole other story. And so I think that all of that really shapes the way that I interpret the Trump administration and what it is doing. And maybe that's all I'll say for now.
Thank you. That was a very helpful turn. What I'd like to do is see if you can get beyond agreeing that Hillary was not the ideal candidate. See if you can do better than that. I'm going to ask you, please, each of one a very brief question and a very brief answer, and then we have a lot of people who want to join the conversation. And I'll start the other way around. So I'm an immigrant, you're an immigrant family. Can you see that some people feel that unlimited immigration, people from different cultures and different backgrounds, stress their communities, and they would like to see some kind of control on immigration? What do you think about that?
Are you asking if I can see how other people might... Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah. I mean, all countries in the world limit immigration.
Sure.
There are many reasons. Part economic jealousy and part prejudices. Part because when people come from different backgrounds, it poses some transition, at least, stress on the community. There are a fair number of Americans who feel overwhelmed even when there's no immigrants in the community. So are they crazy, or do you think there is some point to speak to their concern and address it the way, for instance, the Democrats supported a bill which would limit immigration? Do you have any understanding for where they're coming from?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's coming from a place of fear, right? That our way of life might change. I mean, that would be my guess.
Okay. We'll watch the next play. I'm going to go down this. We'll watch your next play and find out more about it. Mike, first, I appreciate your service in the Marines.
It was my pleasure. And
wait a minute. I haven't. But now I want to ask you a question.
Okay.
And can you see that some of us are concerned about going it alone, and that we see some merit in working closely with allies and establishing international institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question because there is, well, it's a great question because I have an answer prepared, so that's good, right? So speaking of the administration, and I'm glad you asked me because I really want to focus on the decisions that Mr. Trump has made. First off, the current chairman of the Joint Chief is Joe Dunford, who is a Marine general. He's a holdover from the Obama administration. He's a very serious man, speaking of being serious. Chief of Staff is a personal friend of mine, General John Kelly, 4-star, Marine also. And the Defense Secretary is Jim Mattis. And he is an extremely serious person, never been married basically to service and defending the United States. So when you look at the international alliances and going it alone, I just don't see that. Now, I think there is something to be said, and I'm no pure at heart lover of Mr. Trump. I was a fan of a football league that he killed in 1985. Anybody remember those days? But I really think the more important lesson about his style and whether he's going it alone and the things that you don't like about that is that we as Americans, we need to break this paradigm that the president is the pastor of the church of government. I don't agree with that sentiment. I believe that there is quite a bit of my fellow citizens, specifically on the left, that want there to be this Messiah-like figure that's leading our government as the president. And I think that's particularly against the founding. I don't believe that we should be doing that. And so to wrap up your question, I don't believe we're going it alone. We have many, many serious and studied strategic thinkers that are directing our foreign policy. And that's really all I have to say.
I don't think most of us too worried about a Messiah at the White House currently. Bob, what do your friend Sanders and Warren say about the cultural issues? Is there an image that people live by bread alone and we don't have to address their cultural concerns?
It's a great question. Can I take 30 seconds and respond to the question you asked Annalisa first? Because on the question of immigration, we are looking for areas of common ground. That's the whole point of these dialogues. And on immigration, there was common ground. It was bipartisan common ground, and that was the DREAM Act, right? Where you recognize that kids who were brought here as minors, if they behave well, can stay, and then you have an earned path to citizenship. And our president found it expedient to demonize Mexicans in the campaign and to blow up the DREAM Act and to play to people's fears. So I think notwithstanding Trump, there are efforts at consensus. There are efforts at compassion. Now, Elizabeth Warren gave a speech at Netroots Nation where she said, if you listen to Donald Trump, the enemy of a working class person is not Wall Street. The enemy of a working class person is another working class person of a different race or a different cultural heritage, and we are going to say to Donald Trump, you will not divide us. Now, I think the answer to your question is that if we can give people some economic hope for themselves and for their kids, then these horribly divisive cultural issues don't loom quite as large. Hillary got it totally backwards. She billboarded the cultural issues and damped down any thought of what she could do on the pocketbook issues. So this is not easy. It's potentially very, very toxic, but it's possible to bridge over some of the cultural issues by giving people hope.
I'm going to step out for 30 seconds, 29 seconds of my role as a moderator and just say, in my view, not attending head-on to the cultural issues will bedevil the next Democratic candidate. Frank, I want to ask you about deregulation. I know, but there are some of us.
That's how Wall Street runs the country, by the way, because deregulation is boring as hell.
Well, you know what? Let me talk. Okay. Amitai, enough already. There is this crazy idea that America is some kind of a right-wing country. let me disabuse you of that. Right? The
you
horrible,
trying not to answer my question?
the horrible tax policy, the cut in the corporate tax. All we were doing was mimicking Canada and a whole bunch of other countries. The immigration system that Trump supported, it was a bloody point system from Canada. You want to tell me they're racists? And by the way, nothing is more toxic, and nothing, maybe Bannon is right, nothing better serves Trump Republicans than the feel-good sense that anyone you disagree with is a racist. And one hears that so much today. And I want to invite those of you who feel that to consider that self-delight and smugness is not a sign of moral growth. That so many of the counties in Wisconsin flipped from Obama in 2012, 22 of them, to Trump in 2016. My favorite is actually the Harlan County, sacred ground to the left. Harlan County, you know, which side are you on, Pete Seeger, right? 90% for Trump, okay? He reached out to a forgotten constituency.
It's a long time since Harlan County was Democratic.
Well, you know, those counties voted, I think it voted for Obama. Well, okay. You're probably the expert, but a lot of those counties did actually vote. Whoa! A lot of those counties did vote 2008 for Obama. The coal countries, they were just given up. I invite you, in the spirit of dialogue, to think past your easy answers to Trump, which is the feel-good answer that I am holy and they are not. As for immigration, you know something? If you had it, I have my time.
Yeah. Especially since you don't want to answer my question. Michael, I want to go back to Bob. Also didn't do me quite justice. Tell me about the cultural issues. Can we ignore them and just push the economic issues, or do we have to address people's concerns? Let me just remind you of an observation which a colleague of ours, Eileen Rothschild, went and spent 5 years in Louisiana with people later became Trump voters, and she wrote a best-selling book, Strangers in Their Own Land. And one thing she tells is that when she talked to white, less educated people, they kept telling her one story, that they feel like the country is like climbing up a hill where the climb becomes steeper and steeper, and people keep cutting in ahead of the line. And the question is, again, can't we simply ignore that and saying we're going to give everybody more economic growth than Trump gives, which is not a small order, or do we have to address directly the question raised by affirmative action, raised by the changing demography of the country, and how make the people who are troubled by that see the light?
It's a great question, as all your questions. You know, I disagree with my friend Bob there a little bit. I think you can't separate culture and economics. You know, I think that people care deeply about wanting to go back to a certain point where everyone had good jobs. It was everyone they knew had good jobs. It was usually not people of different immigrant groups and different races who had those good jobs. At least that's not in their memory. 1950s was a time when, yes, there was more equality economically, but it was also a time when there was Jim Crow in most parts of the country. I'm not saying that Donald Trump won because of racism. I don't think he did, because as you know, the key votes that changed in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan were people who voted for Obama usually twice and then voted for Trump. So there were white people who had been quite happy to vote for a black man and were not happy to vote for Hillary Clinton. But I think, I've written about this. I think there are certain cultural issues which can be compromised, I think. I think it'd be possible to find common ground on immigration policy, for example, which is partially economic. I mean, the comprehensive immigration bill, which the Senate passed under Obama, which now Republicans are mostly against, I have certain problems with it we could get into if we had time, which we don't. But I think I supported that, and I think it would have been a pretty good plan. But it was a dead letter in the House, and so I would go back to that actually. But on certain issues, even like abortion, which of course is the hottest cultural issue in the country, probably replacing gay marriage. I think if we could agree that children, teenagers would be able to get birth control without, free in their schools or various institutions they're part of, and be encouraged to use birth control if they're going to have sex, that would help a lot, I think. Bill Clinton, I had a lot of differences with him, but he said abortion should be legal but rare, and I think that's the way it should be. So, we should figure out policies on these hot button issues which actually can solve the problem. People who support pro-choice, as I do, who support abortion rights, don't think abortion's a good thing. They don't want people to have abortions. They like to avoid abortions, but they think women have the right to have them if they do get pregnant. But much better to have an agreement that kids who are going to have sex should have easy access to birth control. Now, I know that causes problems, in terms of people's religious faith. I understand that. But to me, that's, a common sense way to not solve the problem, but at least to minimize it.
Leah, I don't want to go home without finding out about deregulation. So, some of us, some liberals are concerned about releasing methane into the air, the coal mines. Removing consumer protection. You know the list. Tell us. How will you explain that to the liberals?
Deregulation is a good thing. Sorry. Okay. I will answer your question if you will let me correct a few misstatements that I've listened to.
Briefly, please.
Okay. Mike, you mentioned 45 years of wage stagnation and the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, and those are the direct result of trade and immigration policies that President Trump is trying to change. The Republican Party is not trying to do anything about voter integrity except to make sure that everyone who votes is eligible to do so.
Civility!
The DREAM Act was the name of a law that was in Congress, but it did not get passed. And President Obama decided to implement most parts of it by executive fiat. So it wasn't a law. Anyway, and so now for deregulation. Okay, so what do you want to know about deregulation, Amitai?
Why is it not hell on wheels?
Deregulation is going on quite a bit. If you look at the Federal Register where regulations are published, you will see that every year the issues of the Federal Register get longer and longer and longer and longer, and the regulations don't go away. They are compounded. They are added onto each other. They are accumulated to the point where Donald J. Trump campaigned on the fact that regulations were strangling the economy. They were strangling industry. And agency by agency, many of the regulations are being pulled back or at least paused so that they can be thought about more carefully. Congress, in enacting legislation from which regulations come, always has a cost-benefit analysis that is done by the Congressional Budget Office to determine what is going to be the cost of this regulation and what is going to be the benefit. They don't really measure the benefit, though, and they look at the costs in a very skimpy way. They don't analyze all the costs of the regulation. And one of my pet peeves is they never go back and say, okay, we passed this law 5 years ago, and this is what we thought it was going to cost, and this is the good we thought it was going to do. Did it? They never do that. So the situation is ripe for deregulation. It must be done carefully. Anytime you have a change in a structure of any sort, you need to do it perhaps incrementally and with plenty of notice.
Well, I'm about to turn it over to you, and we have mics here. Are there two? Is there a mic on your side? Okay. So those of you who support Trump, this is your mic. Now, I want to give chance to both sides. Those of you who are critical, this is your mic. I just want to say we already accomplished one thing. We had a kind of civil conversation we hoped for. We also proved that it's a subject you cannot handle in 1 hour. So, nobody here? Somebody?
Nobody has the nerve to go to that one.
All right. Please keep you're free to statements, not just questions, but you have a question, maybe address it to one or two panel members. Please.
Okay. Gosh, I'm not sure who to address this question to. Perhaps to our climate change Trump guy. My observation is that, I'm sorry? His name's Mike. Mike. Sorry. I can't read this. Thank you, though. All right. Yeah, so my observation is that it is very challenging to arrive at a consensus around policy, etc., if it is not possible to at least begin with some agreement around facts. And I'm surprised that actually we haven't heard the term alternative facts come up in the context of this conversation, this exchange so far. So I guess that's my question. And I want to point out in particular to your question about your point about why does the rest of the world want America to participate in the Paris Treaty? Perhaps because of its contribution to pollution, based on the size of its economy, etc. So I just addressed that question to Mike.
Okay, I'll do my best because, again, I'm just an ordinary citizen like you, but I'll just say this. So the answer is that, and the question was, why does the rest of the world want us to participate, when the real participate is a euphemism for pay. And basically, it was essentially a tax levied on the United States by other countries, including China, India, you name it. I mean, those are just two countries, two very large countries that are polluting at a rate much worse than we are. And, you know, getting just a layer deeper than that, there is this double standard where if you are a member of the global elite, you can say things and do things that are incongruous with the facts on the ground. For example, Germany, and this was pointed out at the latest NATO meeting, getting back to going it alone, Germany is currently under contract to import gas from Russia, a ton of gas. They are going to pay a heck of a lot of money to Russia for gas. Meanwhile, they are demonizing the United States for our attempt to be energy independent. And a final point, which is that if the young people in this audience want jobs, we have to be energy independent. If we want a future, we have to do that. And we have to take things out of the ground and make things with the natural resources. Every nation on the earth, in the history of time, the 5,000 years that we've been doing this, has taken things out of the ground and made things with them. We must continue to do that. Trump is one person who has pushed back on the idea that we need to all be in the service economy. We can't do that. If you're in the state of Minnesota, you need to go out, you need to dig something up and make something out of it.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to say one thing if I could, to the young lady that was just at the mic. She spoke about alternative facts. I believe if one person is on this side of the room and another person on this side of the room looking at one incident there, they're going to see it. They're going to have two different perspectives. They're both observing it, so it's a fact. So you would, in my opinion, maybe yes, have alternative facts because you're seeing it from two different positions. I think science tells us that. So, but now to you all, I'd like just a yes or no from each of you, for the sake of time. I could be up here forever. But prior to the election of President Trump, did we have very serious corrupt government?
Yes.
Yes, and it's even worse now.
Yes, unquestionably, without making a partisan point.
Yes.
not a corrupt government. That's not the right word.
Yeah, I'd want to know more about where the question is coming from, but yeah, I didn't have a lot of faith in many things about our
Well, I would like to say a lot. See,
I'll help you too. I think we had the best government money can buy.
You know, I think really part of our problem is fear is one of the greatest things, you know, that affects mankind. I think we really aren't talking freely. There's some things I haven't heard up here I think you should be talking. And the reluctance to answer this question, I think we really need to have more dialogue. And I know I don't have long, or do I? How much time do I have? Let's look at some things. Ms. O'Connor, I think you said you see this country as an immigrant.
As what?
Or you grew up. Someone said they said.
I
Oh, that was you. Oh,
I mean,
please forgive me. I'm sorry. All right. Well, I see this from a person.
Yeah, lift it up.
Oh, thank you. I see. Oh, yeah, much better. Isn't it? I apologize. Well, see, I grew up not as an African American, but as American black, which is a mixture of. Yeah, we have Native in us, brown people, Europeans, African. That's what made this country great. All right. Now, we don't want to get into when it was great. Well, no, I'll say this: for the first time that I know of, with my limited knowledge, we had a country where the people were sovereign. The power came from us. To me, that was great. Now, along the way, we lost it, which is a different subject. But I'd like to ask this question. I want to make a statement.
That's your last question.
Yeah. I haven't heard the terms of deep state. Any of you ever heard of this?
Fair enough.
QAnon. Anybody heard of that name? Does it mean anything?
Fair
or is
enough.
that just a story?
Somebody will talk about deep
Anybody
state.
hear of QAnon? Is that real stuff or is it not?
Let's answer your question, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Anybody want to talk, Frank?
Well, I was asked at one point to talk about regulation, so I guess I should try to do that.
Okay, already getting places.
I think when I moved here from Canada, I was moving from a less regulated to a much more regulated state. The question is not, is there some gold standard regulation which we've achieved and now we're cutting back from it? No, I mean, different countries have different approaches to this thing. America is pretty heavily regulated. There is a small movement back. I mean, part of it is championed by the head of OIRA, who has an office next to mine at Mason, as it happens. But, one had the sense that the regulatory state, the deep state, was the playground of an elite, of lawyers, of academics, of professionals, right? Well, of course, I've just described myself, but then I always wanted to be a traitor to my class. So the sense is, we had too much of a good thing. Business confidence has come roaring back. With it, the jobs that we've been waiting for so long. The best kind of social welfare program, and we need a good social welfare program, but the best is jobs, real jobs for people.
Let me just, okay. Short, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of regulation becomes a very abstract term, The question is about power, The question is, what does regulation do? I'm sure there are stupid regulations. I've heard, cosmetology isn't much too overregulated. But when did regulation start? Again, I'm being a historian here very quickly, Regulation in a serious way began in the early 20th century. Everybody ever read The Jungle? Because corporations are getting away with murder, literally getting away with murder, in factories, in warehouses, in coal mines. And the idea of regulation was so corporations would have to obey certain rules of the road. And then, and that's true for insurance companies and healthcare. And more recently, with environmental hazards, it's true for companies which pollute. So You can argue that regulation goes too far, that it obviously limits some jobs and has a hard time, and some people want to enter certain professions, have a hard time, perhaps. But why regulation of corporations matters is if you don't have regulation of corporations, corporations can do pretty much whatever they want. And if you think that is going to help working people, I've got a bridge to sell you.
Can I comment on something, Mo? I'd like to comment on something that our questioner of a moment ago brought up. Two things, actually. One, that things look different depending on where you look. There is a style of art called pointillism, which is an artist doesn't use brush strokes, but uses tiny little dots. And if you look very, very closely at one of those paintings, you might see that the orange is actually not orange, but tiny dots of red and tiny dots of yellow, which when you pull back, it looks like orange. And I think that a lot of us, we're looking at things through different filters. Like, I can filter out the things about Donald J. Trump that bother me because there's so much that he does and has accomplished that I'm in favor of. Another thing I wanted to comment on is thank you so much for mentioning that you're American. That's so important. You can move to Japan and live there for 15 years and learn the language, but you're not going to be Japanese. But anybody from anywhere around the world comes to the United States and you can be American, and you don't have to be and shouldn't be, in my view, hyphenated.
Let me just add one thing, and with the danger that I may lose my job as a moderator. I don't think we can live with alternative facts. The notion that the alternative facts is the death of democracy. It's essential. It is essential that people of different background, different values, different interests will recognize that 2 + 2 makes 2, and it's not 6 even on Mondays. And so that's oh well. I said it's not 6 even on Monday. Now, about deregulation, I think it caused us the big recession, and it undermines every value any of us stands for.
Thank you for hearing me. I'm an old soldier, fine. I've lived in Washington since 68 and went to high school here. There are a few people who consider me famous, but there are very few in number. I generally don't have a lot to say, but after these astounding things that have come forth from this board today, it's really astounding. I have to make my question, and I'll make it a simple, straightforward question addressed primarily to the person who brought the subject up, which is our friend from Canada, but everybody can say what you want to about it. It's generally felt that you spend a lot of money getting out of depressions. So Obama spent a lot of money getting out of a depression. He had 8 years, and he was pretty well out of it. He had very high employment, and not quite as high as now, but very high employment. We had a growing economy when we changed presidents. When that happens, you're supposed to use a successful economy to start paying back some of that debt. There has been no effort at that. We are accumulating more debt at almost something like $1 trillion a year, $1 trillion every 2 years, whatever it is. It's astounding. We are passing this on to our families, our generations. The generations come after us. We're passing on a lousy atmosphere in the air to our generations. We're passing on a lousy tax situation to the next generations. We're passing up the idea that we drain America of oil before anything else. We're passing on a whole lot of things which I feel very sorry for our future generations because they are going to somehow have to deal with solving them. Do you have any question as far as concerning, any answers concerning what can be done or what might be done or anything to reduce the load on the future generations to live with the problems that are being presented now?
It's a fair question. Because we're running out of time, we're going to take 2 more questions and then return it to the panel.
So I did not vote for Trump, but my brothers did, and I come from a place that is very red. I come from a place that is working class, where people have lost so much. And they're patriotic. They work in the military. These are conservatives who I love. And I appreciated, Eileen, the way you told your story. And Frank, I appreciated the way you called out smugness, which I think is rife on the left. And Mike, I appreciated you being honest about just how do we make it economically as millennials, the Generation X, Y. That's what I thought I heard you were saying. And I'd love to have each of you, point to each of the conservatives and each of the progressives on the panel, say one very brief thing to another. So if you're conservative, speak to one of the three progressives. You're for progressives, speak to one of the three conservatives. And just point out one thing where you see we could have common ground. And I ask this partially because I did just come also from the climate summit. And I think we're all here because we really care. You wouldn't be here on a sunny night if you didn't really care. There is so much at stake right now, people's lives. And we do have to figure out how to work together. So I would really appreciate it, Eileen, if you could find one of the three others' points of view and just say, I think we could maybe find something to work on here. Thank you.
One more.
Last week, there was a study released by researchers at Pew and Harvard in which white Americans reported, 50% of them reported that white Americans were now a victim of discrimination in this country. They also reported that 80 or 82% of people of color were victims of discrimination. How are we to make sense of this? And I'd like to ask, I guess, particularly the Trump supporters, what are elected officials today supposed to do, and what should candidates for public office tomorrow say about the nature of race in America today, given these findings, particularly the high percentage of whites who now feel that they are a victim of racial discrimination?
I've been authorized by the powers to be to extend the session for 15 minutes. So those of you who at 7 have to leave to play or dinner, we understand. We're going to stop sharply at 7:15 to give more chance to you to ask questions. Panel, would you like to respond to any of the questions so far?
Well, yeah, let me respond by way of offering advice to my friends on the left in all of this. There was a moment where we were not so divided. And that was a moment where we thought that somehow, from the extraordinary diversity of America, we might somehow arrive at policies where the best would emerge. That is, from the crazy quilt of, the lobbyists and the National Association of Manufacturers and the Irish and the Jews and, the African Americans. You put it all together and somehow we'd end up with the greatest good for the greatest number. And that vision has gone. It was abandoned in many respects by the right, through public choice economics and just a heavy degree of cynicism. And it was abandoned by the left with its identity politics. And to the extent that anybody here applauded over suggestions that conservatives are all racist, you're part of the problem, okay? So somehow it would be nice to get that common vision going again. And I guess in order to do that, we have to back up and listen more closely to the things that our friends have said, many of which I agree with.
Let me pick up on the suggestion from the woman at the microphone there to find an area of common ground with one of the conservatives on the panel, and that's Mike. It seems to me that the situation that younger Americans find themselves in economically is, you want to use the word deplorable, that's deplorable. We have saddled two whole generations with $1.3 trillion of college debt, something that my generation never had to experience. We've priced housing beyond the pocketbooks of most young people. We have allowed an employment system where most jobs that young people can get are not even real payroll jobs and don't come with health benefits or pension benefits. Now, it seems to me, and you can look at Betsy DeVos and the indulgence of for-profit universities and for-profit student loan companies, I don't think Donald Trump is making life easier for young people in all of the situations that they're in. So maybe the people who support Trump might want to carry this message to Trump that if you're serious about helping us out, it's not just a matter of $1.6 trillion of tax cuts in the hope that the economy grows on average, which then saddles future generations with debt, which then creates an excuse for cutting Medicare and Social Security. It's a matter of targeting the real problems that are making life harder for younger Americans.
Real quickly, I share, in response to your question over there outside, I share with Frank, primary concern with class, actually, with the way people who are born situations that where they have to, work very hard just to hold things together, where they have to work their way through college instead of getting, their parents to pay for it. And I think a good society is one where, there is more equality, more class equality. Now, part of the problem we have in this country is, that talking that way has never been that popular. For a short time during the Great Depression it was, but basically not. We know race and immigration have been the way people have defined themselves. Even before people talk about identity politics, there was the Irish race and the Jewish race and the Russian race and the Polish race. I don't know about the Canadian race, but so the French-Canadian race. But I think the only way I know of historically, and I think this is still true, in which some of those racial immigration divisions can be not done away with, they're not going to be done away with, but at least people can feel better about them, is with universal programs, which treat people, especially working class people, pretty much the same. Medicare, Social Security, the GI Bill, which of course took a long time to treat black people the same. So to me, one of the reasons I'm a progressive, main reason is because I believe those ideas will help the majority of people, and those kind of programs will help the majority of people. But my concern with how the majority of people are doing, and that's why I bridle a little bit at the idea that the left is smug. Yes, some people on the left are smug, and especially college professors often are smug. But to me, to be on the left, to be a progressive, especially now, means to care about the majority of people and how they're doing, and we share that, I think.
So, so thank you. This is Mr. Professor Kuttner. I appreciate that. So I really, Bob, wanted to say two quick things, and I wanted to answer the questions, if that's okay. So where we can come together, I'm a hunter, fisherman, and there is a long tradition in this country for conservatives to believe in the water, air quality. I know there's a word for it, guns and fishermen for whatever. But the bigger point is not individuals cleaning up after each other at the stream. It's a little less popular, which is that we need to insource our manufacturing back into the United States and deal with the pollution. I personally believe that the United States, through the efforts of all of our engineers, is the best country for manufacturing when it comes to pollution, because we have the EPA, we have the rule of law, and if you look and see what's happening in China and places like that, where they are taking these metals out of the ground and leaving a desolate wasteland, we're basically outsourcing our pollution, which is not a good idea. But I wanted to just throw something out slightly less, which I would hope that we come together on, which is the problem that we're having at the universities, which is not debt, which is the regulation of speech. And I believe, and this is less popular, but I believe that the threat to liberty and freedom on college campuses does not come from the right. I believe the threat to liberty and freedom comes from the left. And I believe that it's important for college professors, including our progressive friends, to denounce the regulation of speech on campus and to make sure that people can speak, including hate speech.
Let me say, we're going to have a special session of civil dialogues only on that subject. May I request, we take 3 more questions. Could you be please brief?
Sure. My name is Julian. I am a college. I'm actually a graduate student at Georgetown University. So I'm also from Germany. I'm happy to follow up on 2 points you made later on. My question, though, is about regulation, because I realized that when conservatives, they don't like to talk about regulation, and when they do, they don't really say anything. I was a visiting researcher in 2016, and I researched the rise of populism in the United States. And part of my research was to listen to podcasts where they interviewed Trump supporters. And there was one woman who said, I'm going to vote for Trump because I don't believe in globalization, and I think Donald Trump doesn't believe in it either. I was very struck by that because, I mean, globalization is just a fact. I don't think it's nothing you can believe in or not. It's just happening. And I was so struck by the narrative that globalization creates losers. And I think that's certainly true for the working class in the United States. It's also true for the working class in Germany and other Western European societies. Though often it is forgotten that it also created a lot of winners. If you look at the income of and profits of multilateral corporations, they have risen to an insane extent. If you look at the bonuses of those managers from those corporations, they have risen to an insane extent. So my question to the Trump supporters is, do you really think that cutting the corporate tax rate, deregulating the economy even further, solves this kind of problem?
I'm going to have one more question here. Let me just say very briefly, the notion that globalization creates losers and winners, but the idea was, even by the harsh libertarians, that you take care of the losers. And the reason we had trade adjustment assistance was not to let them by the wayside and say, forget it, you're a minor of your history. The fact is that trade adjustment system did not work, and we did not take care of the losers.
When you asked the question, why are you here, and gave people 30 seconds to say so, it's because I live across the street. So, I want to thank my friend for giving me her extra ticket. This is supposed to be a discussion on civility. So this is what I would like to hear. And I'm on this side because if I were in the White House in the West Wing, I would say to Donald Trump, you cannot call other countries shitholes. That is not civil. You cannot lie and say that only 60 people died in Puerto Rico when a study was done and showed that 3,000. Mr. Trump, I'm in the West Wing. You cannot say your generals don't know how to win the Afghanistan war. So if we're going to talk about civility, and then I was also struck by the young lady whose parents were from Austria. And I just got through giving a speech. By the way, I do talk radio for Sirius XM, so I could stand here a long time. But the concern I have is we need a Congress. We talk about the Constitution that will check the executive branch. We do not have a Congress that has the constitutional power to check the executive branch. And they can do it in a civil way. And what most members of Congress are saying is that those days are over. And I totally disagree about freedom of hate speech. Totally disagree with it. Just like I disagree with the fact that I'm hearing conversations about African Americans, and if there's something that's lacking on that stage, is an African American. So if I were, I stand on this side as an individual who says, I'm in Donald Trump's camp, and these are the things that you have to do. You must not have fear. Quit pitting people against one another. Our enemy are not Mexicans. Our enemies are not women. Our enemies are not. And let me also ask about, since you had brought about deregulation. I have a wife from Los Angeles. There was a time when you could fly into Los Angeles and not see Los Angeles. And regulation brought about the catalytic converter. And Detroit sold just as many cars with catalytic converter as they did with without. So and we all want to breathe clean air and drink clean water. And that comes about, does it not, from deregulation. And I would also point out, that's deregulation, for the young man who said, we got to take things from the ground and make something out of it. It's not a complete, it's going to run out. Coal's going to run out. Oil's going to run out. And most nations around this planet are now going into solar, wind, and matter of fact, nuclear energy does not come so much from the ground. And part of the problem is we have to put the stuff back into the ground, and it'll be here before these when all our generations are gone. So I close by simply saying, not all regulation is bad. I wish they had deregulated, I wish they had regulated the water in Flint, Michigan, and then maybe folks would be able to drink clean water.
If you leave me your email, we'll improve our diversity in the future. One more.
Yeah. Thanks. I like the dog eating the shoes image. I always found it endearing when my dog would eat my shoes. But going back to that, I do not reduce the president not condemning David Duke or not condemning Klansmen and neo-Nazis in Charlottesville as reducing it to simply a dog eating my shoes, which I could do in my own house. So tell me why I should not be upset about that.
You know what, we're completely running out of time. We're going to ask the two of you to briefly ask questions, give the panel each a minute, and we'll close.
This goes primarily to you, Mike Hill. I'm sorry. This goes to you, primarily to you, and perhaps to Elaine, because I think thank you. Okay. I was very troubled by your remark that the government is not the Messiah. The reason I was troubled by that is because my parents grew up, and they were born in 1924, grew up in the Deep South. And I don't think I need to go down the history road for you to understand how that would be. So I was growing up when Martin Luther King was marching for civil rights. And I grew up believing in the Constitution. When I learned about it, I had faith in the Constitution. I had faith in this government. And I know that we cannot, to use the phrase we've been using, regulate individual people's things and thoughts. But I saw the government as the great equalizer, not the Messiah, but the great equalizer, because that, to me, was the neutral body who could make things fair. So that bothers me when you say that the government is not the Messiah. And my concern with deregulation, I have a health condition, so I am concerned about the air and all of those things. And I think perhaps the pendulum, because you made me think about that with your remark, may have swung too far with regulations. And maybe we do need to examine them and air them out, but we still need it. Because I see the government as the great equalizer.
Thank you. Last note.
Hi there. So I was born in 1980, so I'm almost a millennial. Some people consider me a millennial, others do not. That generation, and myself included, are shown to care more about the environment than other generations. It's one of the things that we vote on. It's one of the things that we talk about. So, Mike, we are thinking about it. It's really important to us, and that doesn't mean that the economy isn't important to us. But that's not my question. So, there's a couple states that have been known to make moves to exit the union. Texas is the really famous one, and I don't know if anyone has heard out here that there's a group of Californians that are working right now on legislation to start the steps to leave the union. And I thought this might be a place where you all could agree. Maybe, I don't know. So I want to know, how do you, as mostly, I'm guessing, Washingtonians, think of states entering or leaving the union? Is that...
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
But we're going to get each panelist a very brief moment, starting with you, Annalise, to closing comments. Very brief, please.
Oh, Lord, that was a lot.
You can say see you next week.
No, actually, I haven't said a whole lot up here, and I'm not a person that can. It takes me a while to sort of listen and then formulate thoughts about what I want to say. And I had been kind of debating about whether or not I wanted to bring up the issue of white supremacy, because I was nervous actually when I like sort of looked at the panel, and I was like, oh. I'm going to be a whole bunch of white people, and that's kind of weird when we're talking about Trump. And so to whoever it was that brought up that like, right, look at the composition of the panel, I felt already nervous and wary about what I could say and sorry, I'm not making a whole lot of sense, because I feel like there has been a bit of a dismissal of identity politics as though it's something to be discarded, and for people, I guess it doesn't matter. Maybe I'm mishearing, but I feel like there has been a bit of a dismissal of it, I'll say for me, the last 2 years have been terrifying for a number of reasons, but I have seen hate speech. I have experienced it on a daily basis. I've seen violence in communities rise against people of color. Let me be explicit, and against indigenous peoples. So I guess I don't know that I have a point other than to bring up that the composition of this panel made me nervous, and that's all I'd like to say.
Thank you, Annalise. Thank you very much.
Yes, just wanted to answer a couple of questions, and maybe briefly, right. So the Constitution, as I understand it, I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I'm not a climatologist either, but the idea of the Constitution and of the United States, particularly in the government, is that it's a system of checks and balances, in that it recognized, the people that wrote the Constitution recognized that there was tyranny, and there's tyranny in all people, in all forms of government, and they did all they could to write the Constitution in such a way there was checks and balances, recognizing the failure of people to govern, and that if you have power, tyranny comes from that. And I want to say one little thing about that, which is I believe the president, not this president or any president, is too powerful a figure. And that's what was my point about the pastor of the church of government. We need to eliminate that position and just have the president be the head of the executive branch. But I also wanted to say something in defense of sort of the conservative viewpoint, which is that, and it answers both questions. I believe that right now we have what most people would consider to be somewhat of an ugly man as president. He's not particularly attractive physically. His verbs, his use of the words is not particularly attractive. And I think it's okay that we have an ugly president, because it reminds us that that position need not be so powerful.
Thank you. Bob?
I don't find his haircut or his mangling of the English language ugly. I find his stirring up of hatred ugly. And at the risk of being called smug, I acknowledge that most people who voted for Donald Trump are not racists. Most people who voted for Donald Trump are people who feel disrespected and aggrieved because the good life has been taken away from them. It behooves liberals to understand where those folks are coming from, or Donald Trump and people like Donald Trump will keep getting elected. But some of them are racists, and let's not pretend that that's not a fact, and let's not pretend that when Trump gets on television and says of Charlottesville there are good people on both sides, that's not stirring up racism. So there's a very delicate threading of the needle here, where on the one hand, it's very important to validate, to affirm, and to remedy all the things that have caused good people to feel disaffected from this economy, and at the same time, to really distance ourselves and to fight against racism.
Let me take up the point that was raised right at the end about secession. Yes, perhaps I'm the only person here who's lived through secession campaigns in Quebec. And the debate there, by the way, was vastly more polite, collegial, and friendly than anything I've heard here in America, including tonight. And so I recall something that Hillary Clinton said. She said of the Trump supporters, or the deplorables amongst them, well, thankfully, they're not America. But if they're not America, they might well wonder to what country they belong or should belong. And it's talk like that that makes people think seriously about secession. There are secession movements in just about every country, especially large ones. And are we to think that we only should be immune from any of that? No, I don't.
Thanks, everybody, for sticking around and listening. This could go on much longer, obviously. But the play's the thing. I'm glad Annalisa said what she said, because it makes me think of a point I was thinking of all along. You know, there's been so much discussion of, the people who Arlie Hochschild wrote about, white working class people who feel, as Bob said, that they've lost a lot, and many of them have, certainly. But if you're going to be empathetic with those people, and we should be, you have to be empathetic with people who are not white, who are also working class for the most part, who are the majority in many states in this country, and they can become more of the majority because whatever Donald Trump is doing, immigration is not going to go down. So I think, if we're going to listen to each other, we have to listen to each other talking about our pain and not say, well, certain people have more right to talk about it because other people are smug. So, and also, for those, it's easy to say this in D.C. where Trump got 4% of the vote, but more and more as, the macroeconomy has done very well under Trump and is doing pretty well under the last few years of Obama too, and Trump has not got more popular, it makes me think that, Trumpism is not going to last. So those who support Trump, it will continue in other ways, but I really have come to think more and more that, in fact, this man and his strange ideology, combination of all kinds of things, is not going to last, and that comforts me.
I want to thank you all also for sticking around, and I want to just make a couple of points. Republicans, conservatives, Trump supporters do not, I repeat, do not want dirty air and water. It's a fact. And deregulation notwithstanding, the differences that we have about air and water is not, do we want it or not? Do we want clean water, clean air? But how to go about it, and what balance do you strike between the regulation that's necessary to accomplish it and the best that you can do with it making sense? And Annalisa, I appreciate you also mentioning the racial balance. Mike, I'm sorry you were not my first choice. We had a member of the panel who dropped out at a fairly late date, and I was trying to find somebody new, and everybody on my list until you were found. All the people that I invited were black, but they were busy. So anyway, so there it is. Amitai wants me to quit, and I think that was probably my last point anyway.
You're all invited to join us a month from now when we're going to talk about digital well-being, about the danger the internet poses to screen addiction to children, to foreigners who manipulate our elections, to bullying, how to retrieve the internet to make it again a wholesome place. Please help me for thanking the panel for a very civil conversation.